What if Gandalf the Great met Albus Dumbledore? The great hall of Hogwarts was alive with flickering candlelight. Though the war against Voldemort had ended, Hogwarts still bore scars. Some walls had been repaired, but the memories of battle lingered. Albus Dumbledore sat at the head of the table, sipping mead. It was a miracle that he was here at all. Had things gone differently, he would have died atop the astronomy tower, just as Severus Snape would have perished in the Shrieking Shack. But fate, it seemed, had taken another path. The air suddenly hummed with power. A gust of wind blew through the hall, snuffing out a few candles. Then, as if stepping through an unseen veil, a tall, robed figure appeared, leaning on a wooden staff. Gandalf had arrived. Dumbledore smiled. "Ah, you made it. Welcome to Hogwarts, Gandalf." Gandalf studied the great hall, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. A place of learning, yet one that has seen war. He nodded solemnly. Much like my own world. Before more could be said, the heavy doors creaked open. Harry Potter stepped in, his green eyes filled with curiosity. Hermione and Ron followed close behind. "Professor?" Harry asked cautiously. "Who is this?" Dumbledore gestured. "Harry, meet Gandalf. He is a wizard, though not from our world." "Another world?" Hermione's eyes widened. "That's incredible." Ron, still wary, muttered, "Blimey, how do people keep showing up from other worlds?" Before Gandalf could answer, another voice cut through the room. Severus Snape swept inside, his black robes billowing. His sharp eyes flickered toward the unfamiliar wizard. "Headmaster," he drawled, "I assume this is not another one of your peculiar hiring decisions?" Dumbledore chuckled. "No, Severus. This is Gandalf, a fellow wizard from another realm." Snape's lips curled in skepticism. "Indeed." His gaze flicked to the students. "And why, precisely, are they here?" Gandalf regarded Snape with mild curiosity. "You are no ordinary man," he said after a pause. Snape stiffened. "And what precisely does that mean?" Gandalf's eyes softened. "You have walked a difficult path, one of great sorrow, yet great loyalty." Snape's expression did not change, but something in his stance shifted. Dumbledore's gaze twinkled knowingly. "It seems even in other worlds, wisdom recognizes sacrifice," Dumbledore murmured. Before Snape could respond, another voice called from the entrance. "Blimey, what's all this?" Hagrid strode in, looking bewildered. "Professor Dumbledore, you didn't tell me we were having company." His eyes landed on Gandalf, and he stopped in his tracks. "Wait a minute. You look just like—" Gandalf smiled. "Rubeus Hagrid, is it?" "Aye," Hagrid said. He peered at the visitor. "You remind me of an old friend, Dumbledore himself, but with a walking stick." Gandalf chuckled. "It seems great beards think alike." Hagrid laughed, but Harry, Hermione, and Ron were still watching Gandalf closely. "Sir," Hermione asked hesitantly, "what kind of magic do you use?" Gandalf smiled. "I do not wield magic as you do, with wands and incantations. My power is older, woven into the world itself. I can guide, I can protect, and when needed, I can unleash fire and light against the darkness." Harry nodded slowly. "Like the Patronus charm." "In a way," Gandalf said, "but I am not here to teach. I am here to listen, to learn, and perhaps to share a tale or two before I must return." Dumbledore clapped his hands together. "Then let us share stories." His eyes twinkled. "After all, knowledge is best when exchanged." Gandalf studied Snape closely. "You are a man of shadows," he murmured. "Yet you have walked through fire and survived." Snape's lip curled. "You make me sound dramatic." Dumbledore chuckled. "Perhaps because you are, my dear Severus." A grunt came from behind them. I hope this isn't another bloody impostor, growled Alastair Moody as he stomped into the hall, his magical eyes spinning wildly. We've had enough of those. No, Alastor, Dumbledore said, amused. Gandalf is quite real. Before more could be said, a rotund figure in elegant robes bustled in. Oh, Albus, I heard we had a guest, and I simply had to see— Horace Slughorn froze mid-step, staring at Gandalf. Merlin's beard. That is a magnificent beard, my dear sir. Have you ever considered using dragon oil? Keeps it from frizzing. Slughorn looked over at Dumbledore curiously and asked, Another wizard, you say? Well, well, do you happen to collect rare and powerful artifacts, my dear sir? Gandalf chuckled. Only the wisdom I carry. Dumbledore coughed lightly. Perhaps later. For now, Gandalf, I believe you might find something of great interest in my study. Gandalf nodded. Lead the way. The silver liquid in the pensive swirled, its glow flickering in the dim candlelight of Dumbledore's office. Gandalf, standing before the basin, gripped his staff. A vessel of memory. A remarkable magic. Dumbledore nodded. Would you like to walk through history with us? Gandalf glanced at Harry, Snape, and the others. Then, without hesitation, he reached out. Whoosh! The world twisted. They stood in a sunlit garden. Two young men sat on the grass, speaking in hushed, fervent tones. One was a younger Albus Dumbledore. The other was striking, blonde-haired, sharp-featured, and exuding charisma. Gellert Grindelwald. You and I, Albus, Grindelwald was saying, we could shape the future. Wizards should not hide like frightened children. We are superior. We should rule for the greater good. Gandalf frowned. He believed his cause was righteous. Dumbledore, watching alongside him, sighed. That was what made him so dangerous. The scene shifted. A duel between Dumbledore and Grindelwald took place in a whirlwind of magic. Spells shattered stone, fire met ice, the very air trembled. Then, Ariana Dumbledore collapsed, lifeless. Grindelwald fled. Gandalf exhaled. Ambition without restraint leads only to ruin. Dumbledore nodded. It was my greatest lesson. The scene changed again. An aged Grindelwald sat in his cell in Nurmengard prison, which was a prison he himself created to house his enemies, his golden hair now silver, his power stripped away. Yet his eyes, even dulled by time, still held defiance. You came, Grindelwald said. At last. Dumbledore, older now, stood outside the bars. You know why I am here? Grindelwald gave a hollow laugh. For the truth, or for closure. You were the best of us, Gellert, Dumbledore murmured. And yet it was you who destroyed me, Grindelwald whispered. No, Dumbledore said, you destroyed yourself. The memory began to fade, but then something else surfaced in the pensive. The same prison. Years later. The torches flickered as the door creaked open. A tall, snake-like figure stepped into the cell, his pale face lit only by the cold, flickering light. Lord Voldemort. You do not fear me, Voldemort said softly, tilting his head. Grindelwald sat unmoving, his gaunt face unreadable. I have faced true power, boy. You do not impress me. Voldemort's red eyes narrowed. You know why I am here? Grindelwald smirked. The Elder Wand. Ah, of course. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. I had it once, you know. True power in my grasp, and yet, power alone is not enough. Voldemort's expression twisted in anger. Where is it? Grindelwald leaned forward, meeting his gaze. I know what you are, Tom Riddle, a child who fears death so much that he carved his soul into pieces. And yet, here you stand, seeking a wand to make you whole. Voldemort hissed, raising his wand. Tell me, Grindelwald, tell me where it is. Grindelwald leaned back against the wall, smiling faintly. You understand so little, he stated. A few moments went by where neither man spoke, but instead stared at one another until Grindelwald said weakly, Unlike you, Voldemort, I welcome death. A jet of green light erupted and Grindelwald crumpled, lifeless. The scene faded. Gandalf's grip on his staff tightened. The Dark Lord of your time was ruthless. More than ruthless, Dumbledore said gravely. Voldemort feared death more than anything. That fear defined him. The pensive rippled again. A bitter October wind rustled the leaves in Godric's Hollow. Moonlight bathed the small Potter cottage, its windows glowing with warmth. Inside, Lily Potter sat beside a crib, running her fingers through the dark tufts of baby Harry's hair. James Potter's laughter echoed from another room. You're going to be a great flyer one day, Harry. I just know it. A sudden explosion shook the house. The front door burst open, sending shards of wood flying. A tall, hooded figure stepped through the wreckage. Lord Voldemort had found them. James whipped out his wand, stepping between his family and the intruder. Lily, take Harry and go. It's him, Lily screamed, clutching Harry to her chest and racing upstairs. Gandalf watched as James squared his shoulders, wand raised. Not Harry. Take me instead. Voldemort didn't even pause. Avada Kedavra. A flash of green light. James crumpled, lifeless. Gandalf exhaled sharply. A father's last stand. Yet the Dark Lord does not even spare him a glance. The vision rushed forward, Lily barricading the nursery door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Voldemort ascended the stairs slowly, his wand raised, his voice a silken whisper. Step aside, foolish girl. I only want the boy. Lily shook her head violently, pressing herself against Harry's crib. Please, not Harry. Take me instead. A long, eerie silence. Then, Avada Kedavra. A brilliant green flash of light struck Lily in the chest. She collapsed. Gandalf's expression darkened. A mother's love, offered freely, and yet he did not understand its power. Voldemort now stood over the crib, staring down at baby Harry, who had begun to cry. The Dark Lord smiled coldly, raising his wand. Avada Kedavra! The curse shot forward, but something went wrong. The green light rebounded, colliding into Voldemort's chest. He screamed, a piercing, inhuman wail, as his body disintegrated into black mist. A single lightning-shaped wound seared into Harry's forehead. Gandalf watched silently, his blue eyes glistening. A power older than magic itself. He destroyed himself the moment he cast that curse. The Pensieve swirled, and Gandalf found himself standing in a dark, underground chamber beneath Hogwarts. The room was filled with tall black pillars, and at its center stood an ancient mirror. The mirror of Erasaid. A younger Harry Potter, barely 11, stood frozen before it, his wide green eyes locked on his own reflection. Gandalf watched as Harry patted his pockets, his face flickering with confusion. I have the stone, he whispered. But how? Behind him, a soft chuckle echoed through the chamber. Bravo, Harry, a familiar, trembling voice called. Astonishing, really. Gandalf turned. From the shadows stepped Professor Quirinus Quirrell, still clad in his distinctive purple turban, his fingers twitching. You? Harry gasped. Me, Quirrell said, his voice suddenly stronger, dripping with amusement. Snape. He was trying to protect me? Quirrell sneered. Yes, he does seem the type, doesn't he? He stepped forward, his eyes flashing. Poor, stuttering Professor Quirrell, always overlooked, always underestimated. Gandalf watched him closely, sensing something else at work. "Why don't you hand me that stone in your pocket?" Quirrell asked smoothly. Harry's fingers clenched around the philosopher's stone. "No." Quirrell's smile dropped. "He lies," came a voice, a soft, hissing whisper, curling through the air. Harry's blood ran cold. "Who was that?" Quirrell's lip curled in disgust. "You see what I have to put up with?" He reached for the knot of his turban, gripping it with both hands. "Very well. Let me show you." Gandalf took a step forward, his staff gripped tightly as Quirrell slowly unwrapped his turban. The cloth fell to the floor, revealing something horrible. On the back of Quirrell's head, where hair and flesh should have been, was a twisted, grotesque face. A serpentine face, chalk white and skull-like with burning red eyes. Voldemort. Gandalf stared, his expression unreadable. "Harry Potter," the face whispered. Harry froze, unable to move. "See what I have become." Voldemort's voice was soft, almost coaxing. "Mere shadow and vapor. I have form only when I share another's body, but there have always been those willing to let me in." Gandalf's jaw tightened. "A parasite," he murmured, "clinging to the weak, feeding on them." Voldemort's burning eyes flicked toward Gandalf for a split second, as if he could somehow sense him in the memory. "Why don't you give me the stone, Harry?" Voldemort said silkily. "You see how it is. I must be whole again." Harry shook his head. "Don't be a fool," Voldemort hissed. "Better save your own life and join me, or you will meet the same end as your parents." "Never!" Harry shouted. "Seize him!" Voldemort screeched. Quirrell lunged. But the moment he touched Harry's skin, his hands burned. Quirrell screamed as his fingers charred to ash, his skin blistering from contact. Gandalf's eyes narrowed. "His very being rejects darkness." Dumbledore nodded. "Lily's sacrifice lingers in his blood. Voldemort cannot touch him." Harry, desperate, pressed his hands against Quirrell's face. Quirrell howled in agony, his skin blackening, peeling away. The professor collapsed into dust, his body crumbling at Harry's feet. Voldemort's ghostly form tore itself from the dying man, letting out a piercing, inhuman shriek. Harry fainted, just as Voldemort's spirit rushed past them, vanishing into the night. The chamber fell silent. Gandalf watched the boy, breathing heavily, his fingers twitching in unconsciousness. The memory began to fade. The scene shifted. They stood in a graveyard, cloaked in mist. Harry, now older, struggled against the ropes binding him to a tombstone. Nearby, Wormtail prepared a bubbling cauldron, muttering an incantation. The bone of the father, unknowingly given. He tossed dust into the cauldron. The flesh of the servant, willingly sacrificed. He cut off his own hand. It splashed into the potion. Gandalf's expression was grim. Dark magic of the highest order. Finally, Wormtail turned to Harry, pressing a dagger against his arm. "And the blood of the enemy. Forcibly taken." Blood dripped into the cauldron. The liquid bubbled violently, glowing an unnatural, sickly light. Then, a figure emerged, tall, pale, serpentine. Voldemort had returned. Gandalf studied the Dark Lord carefully. "He has forsaken his own nature. He clings to this world through perversion." Voldemort raised his arms, his red eyes gleaming. "How many will be brave enough to return?" hissed Voldemort. Death Eaters apparated into the graveyard, kneeling before him. Voldemort turned to Harry. "Bow to me, Harry Potter." He spat. Harry refused. Voldemort's eyes narrowed. "Crucio!" Harry screamed, convulsing under the curse. Gandalf's staff crackled with unseen energy. "Cowardice! He tortures a child to prove his strength." Then, golden light erupted from Harry's wand. Ghostly figures materialized James and Lily Potter. Lily smiled. "We love you, Harry. We never left you." Harry seized the port key and vanished. The graveyard faded. They were in a Muggle village, the air thick with smoke. Death Eaters moved through the streets, their wands flashing. Families were dragged from their homes. Screams echoed in the night. Voldemort strode through the chaos, his expression cold and unmoved. Gandalf watched, his face grim. "This is no mere conquest. This is slaughter." The memory shifted. Now they were in Malfoy Manor. A figure floated above the grand table. Charity Burbage, a Hogwarts professor. "Please, Severus," she whimpered. Severus Snape sat motionless as Voldemort flicked his wand. "Avada Kedavra." The professor's body hit the table. Hermione let out a quiet gasp, gripping Harry's arm. Ron looked sick. Snape, watching from outside the memory, remained silent, his face unreadable. The office melted away, and suddenly they were standing in a cold orphanage hallway. Rain lashed against the windows, and a young Albus Dumbledore stood before an eerie-looking boy with dark eyes. "Tom Riddle," Gandalf murmured. The memory played out, Dumbledore calmly questioning the child, who demonstrated unnatural control over objects in his room. "Is it true, sir?" Tom asked, eyes gleaming. "I can make them hurt?" The boy smiled. Gandalf's expression darkened. A child of great potential, but already touched by darkness. The scene shifted. Now they stood in the Chamber of Secrets. A teenage Tom Riddle loomed over a fallen girl, Ginny Weasley. "She won't wake," he said, his voice smooth, calculated. Harry stood opposite him, clutching Godric Gryffindor's sword. Gandalf watched with keen interest as Fawkes the Phoenix dropped the sorting hat beside Harry. Then came the great serpent, the basilisk. Gandalf turned to Dumbledore. "This boy, he has courage beyond his years." "Yes," Dumbledore said, "and he needed it more than most." Whoosh! The memory shifted again. Now they were in a cold, dark cave. Dumbledore stood at the edge of a black lake, his hand trembling. Harry stood beside him, uncertain. "You must make me drink, Harry," Dumbledore rasped. Gandalf watched, his eyes full of sorrow, as Harry hesitated, then lifted the goblet. Spoonful by spoonful, the potion forced Dumbledore into agony. "Please, no more." Gandalf clenched his staff. This was the price of knowledge. Dumbledore, standing beside him in the memory, nodded. "Sometimes, to fight the darkness, we must endure it." Whoosh! They stood on the astronomy tower. Dumbledore was weak, leaning against the battlements. Snape stood before him, wand raised. "Severus, please," Dumbledore whispered. Snape's face was unreadable until he raised his wand and... The memory changed. Dumbledore lay in a hospital bed instead of dying. Snape stood beside him, his face cold but his hands shaking. "You should have died," Snape murmured. Dumbledore chuckled weakly. "And yet, here we are." The memory dissolved, and they were now in the Shrieking Shack. Severus Snape lay against the wall, blood pooling beneath him. Nagini had struck. Harry knelt beside him, Hermione and Ron close behind. "You have your mother's eyes," Snape whispered. A single tear slipped from his eye as his body stilled. Gandalf watched intently. He loved her, and so he gave everything. Snape, standing outside the memory, stiffened. "Sentimentality is hardly necessary." "Not sentimentality," Gandalf said gently. "Purpose. You were a man of grief, but you found meaning in it." Snape said nothing. The pensieve swirled again. Back in Dumbledore's office, Gandalf pulled back, his eyes full of understanding. "Fate was rewritten," he murmured. The end was not as it was meant to be. Dumbledore nodded. We made choices, different ones, and here we stand. Gandalf smiled. Even the smallest choices can change the course of history. That I have seen before. You have faced evil in many forms, he said to Harry. Harry nodded, his jaw tight. Yeah. Gandalf studied him. And yet, you never let it consume you. Dumbledore smiled. That, dear Gandalf, is Harry's greatest strength. Gandalf turned to Dumbledore. Your world has known great darkness, but I see now it has also known great light. Dumbledore nodded. The war cost us dearly, but Harry and his friends proved that even the darkest night will end. Gandalf looked at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. You have seen horrors that would break most men, and yet you endure. Harry met his gaze. We had no choice. We had to fight. Gandalf smiled. You did have a choice, and you chose rightly. He turned to Snape. And you are perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Snape's lip curled. How poetic. Gandalf chuckled. You lived a life of sacrifice, yet never sought glory. That is rare indeed. Snape said nothing, but something flickered in his dark eyes. Gandalf turned back to Dumbledore. You have faced darkness and conquered it, but the battle never truly ends, does it? Dumbledore sighed. Number, but we can always prepare the next generation to fight it. Gandalf smiled. And that is wisdom. As Gandalf prepared to leave Hogwarts, Dumbledore placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. There is something else you should see before you go. Gandalf followed as Dumbledore led him through the great hall, past the long tables where students once gathered. They approached a large set of doors, guarded by two silent aurors. One of them stepped aside, pushing the doors open. Inside, the chamber was dimly lit, the torches casting long shadows across the smooth stone floor. At the center of the room, laid on a marble platform, was Voldemort's body. Gandalf stepped forward, his staff tapping softly against the stone. He gazed down at the lifeless form before him, the pale, skeletal remains of a man who once sought to dominate the world. And yet in death he was small, fragile, powerless. For a long moment Gandalf simply studied him, his sharp blue eyes taking in every feature. The hollowed cheeks, the long fingers, the stillness that now clung to him like an old, forgotten cloak. He seems lesser than I expected, Gandalf murmured. Harry stepped up beside him, his expression unreadable. I thought so too. His voice was quiet. After everything, after all the destruction he caused, he wasn't anything special in the end, just another body. Gandalf sighed, his fingers brushing against his staff. I have seen him before, he said softly, in every memory you showed me, in the orphaned boy who feared the world, in the young man who sought power to fill the emptiness inside him, in the tyrant who tortured others, not for pleasure, but to silence his own fear. Harry said nothing, but his grip tightened at his side. Gandalf's gaze did not waver. From the moment he was a child, he was searching for something. He turned to Dumbledore. You saw it too, didn't you? Dumbledore's face was grave. Yes. What was he looking for? Hermione whispered. Gandalf exhaled, a sadness touching his ancient eyes. He was looking for a mother's love. Silence filled the chamber. Gandalf continued, his voice quiet but certain. It was there in every moment I witnessed. Tom Riddle never knew love, and so he feared it. He resented it. He saw it as a weakness. His fingers traced the handle of his staff. But love is not weakness. Love is the one thing he could not break, could not control. And in the end, it was the one thing that defeated him. Dumbledore nodded solemnly. A lesson he never learned. no matter how many chances he was given. Gandalf turned back to Voldemort's body, his expression unreadable. If someone had loved him, truly loved him, perhaps none of this would have happened. Harry's jaw clenched. But no one did. Gandalf sighed. Number. And so he became what he feared the most, alone. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the distant rustling of banners in the great hall beyond. Finally, Dumbledore broke the silence. His body will be buried in an unmarked grave, away from his followers. There will be no shrine, no tomb for anyone to honor him. Gandalf nodded. A fitting end for one who sought to be eternal. With one last glance at the fallen Dark Lord, Gandalf turned and stepped out of the chamber. As Gandalf prepared to leave Hogwarts, he turned to Dumbledore. "You have shown me much," he said, "but I sense there is still more to understand. Before I depart, I would like to see the beginning of his story." Dumbledore nodded solemnly. "Then let us return one last time." He touched the pensieve, and the silver mist swirled once more. Whoosh! The scene shifted. Gandalf now stood in a crumbling shack, surrounded by the stench of decay. The air was thick with neglect and cruelty. A thin, sickly-looking man with wild, tangled hair sat at a table, hissing in parcel tongue. His dark, sunken eyes glared at a frightened young woman who cowered in the corner. "This is the home of the Gaunts," Dumbledore explained, stepping beside Gandalf. "Voldemort's mother, Merope, was raised here, among violence and hatred." The gaunt man, Marvolo Gaunt, held up a golden ring, his voice full of twisted pride. "This proves our bloodline is pure. We are the last of Slytherin's true heirs." His son, a sallow-faced boy named Morphin, grinned madly, flicking a small snake between his fingers. Merope said nothing. She simply stared at the floor, too broken to speak. "She was treated as little more than a servant," Dumbledore said softly. "Beaten. Mistreated. Yet she possessed magic far greater than her father and brother ever realized." Gandalf's face darkened. A home without love. "Indeed," Dumbledore murmured, "and when her father and brother were imprisoned, she saw her chance to escape." The scene shifted. The air was thick with filth and neglect. The walls of the shack were covered in grime, the floor littered with broken glass and old bones. Gandalf stood inside a crumbling stone hovel, the stench of rot and damp wood clinging to the air. He realized he was still in the Gaunt shack. At the center of the room sat Marvolo Gaunt, a thin, sickly man with wild, unkempt hair. His dark eyes burned with madness as he turned a golden ring in his fingers, the Peverell ring, a relic of his bloodline. Across from him, a younger, more wretched figure crouched in the corner, trembling. A thin girl with dull, tangled hair and hollowed-out cheeks. Merope Gaunt. She flinched as her brother Morphin flicked a small snake toward her, laughing in hissing parcel-tongue. "You filthy squib," Marvolo spat, his voice filled with disgust. "I should have drowned you at birth." Merope shrank back, her bony fingers clutching the hem of her tattered dress. "Stupid girl, useless girl," Morphin sneered, gripping his wand. "Can't even speak proper parcel tongue. No real Gaunt blood in you." Marvolo's rage boiled over. He lunged, striking Merope across the face with the back of his hand. She fell to the floor, blood trickling from her lip. Gandalf's expression darkened, his grip on his staff tightening. A home without love, only cruelty. Dumbledore's voice was quiet. She had no kindness, no warmth, no escape. Suddenly, the sound of horse hooves clattered outside. A young, handsome man in fine riding clothes passed by the house, his dark hair tousled by the wind. Tom Riddle Sr. Merope lifted her head slightly, watching through the grime-covered window as the wealthy muggle rode past, laughing with his friends. Something changed in her eyes. Longing, desperation, the only person who had never hurt her. The memory blurred. Merope stood in the gaunt shack, alone for the first time. Her father and brother had been arrested, dragged away by the Ministry for attacking muggles. For the first time, she was free, but freedom meant nothing if she remained alone. She moved to a dusty shelf, running her fingers along a collection of old vials, ingredients for potions, left to rot in the corner. Gandalf watched silently as Merope's shaking hands reached for a tiny bottle. Amortentia. Dumbledore's voice was heavy. She knew no kindness, so she created it. The scene shifted again to a winding dirt road through the countryside. Tom Riddle Sr. rode his horse, his eyes shining with careless arrogance, the wind rushing through the trees. Then, a girl stepped into the road. She was pale, her long dress swaying, her brown eyes filled with something strange. Tom pulled back on the reins, startled. "You!" Merope smiled softly, tilting her head. "Hello, Tom," she murmured. The next memory flashed forward. A wedding. A small, private ceremony. Tom Riddle Sr. stood at the altar, his expression dazed, his movements unnatural. Merope, in borrowed white, beamed. Gandalf observed closely. "Not love? Enchantment?" Dumbledore nodded. For the first time in her life, she had something she wanted, but it was not real. The scene shifted again. A grand estate, the Riddle Manor. Tom Riddle Sr. sat in a lavish drawing room, staring at Merope with confusion and irritation. "What am I doing here?" he muttered. "How did this happen?" Merope stood near the fireplace, her hands resting over her stomach, a small roundness just beginning to show. She looked at Tom with pleading eyes. "Stay," she whispered. "Please stay." Tom's expression darkened. "You did something to me." Merope's breath hitched. "No, no, I love you." Tom Riddle Sr. stepped back, his features twisting in disgust. "I don't love you," he said coldly. "I never did." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Merope collapsed onto the floor, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking. Gandalf's face was unreadable, but his fingers clenched over his staff. She had no magic strong enough to force love, so she let him go, hoping he would choose to stay. Dumbledore sighed, but he did not. The memory faded. Merope's escape, and her death. Now Gandalf stood on the cobbled streets of London, where a young, pale woman, Merope Gaunt, staggered through the winter cold. Her pregnant belly was swollen beneath her tattered cloak. Snow fell lightly, dusting her thin shoulders. She stopped in front of a small orphanage, breathing heavily. Clutching her stomach, she whispered through chapped lips, "Tom. I will name him Tom." She stepped inside. The scene blurred, jumping forward. Merope lay in a thin, rickety bed, soaked in sweat, her breath ragged. A midwife stood nearby, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a rough wool blanket. "The boy," Merope whispered. "Name him Tom. Tom. Marvolo. Riddle." Her hand twitched, as if reaching for her child. Then, with a final shuddering breath, she was gone. The midwife simply shook her head. Didn't even try to live, poor thing. The baby cried, wailing for a mother who would never hold him. Gandalf closed his eyes for a moment. She had nothing left to live for. Dumbledore nodded. She believed, perhaps, that her son would be loved, but she left him to a world that had no love for him. The cries of infant Tom Riddle faded. The scene changed. A large, elegant manor loomed before them. The Riddle House. Inside, an older couple sat stiffly in a lavish parlor, sipping tea. A young, handsome man, Tom Riddle Sr., stood near the window, staring outside, bored and impatient. Gandalf's brow furrowed. His father? Dumbledore nodded. Tom Riddle Sr. He abandoned Merope when her magic no longer held him under its spell. He never knew he had a son. Then the door creaked open. A shadowy figure stepped inside. A young man in dark robes with sharp features and cold, unfeeling eyes. Gandalf did not need to ask. He knew. Tom Riddle had come home. There was no emotion on his face as he raised his wand. Avada Kedavra. A flash of green. Tom Riddle Sr. slumped forward, lifeless. His parents barely had time to gasp before the second and third flashes came. The Riddle family lay dead, their faces frozen in horror. Tom Riddle tilted his head slightly as if admiring his work. Then he turned and slid a golden ring onto his finger. Gandalf's eyes narrowed. The gaunt ring. Dumbledore nodded. The first Horcrux he ever made. The room faded into darkness. A new scene formed, this time in an elegant, overdecorated sitting room filled with fine tapestries and golden treasures. A plump old woman, Hepzibah Smith, sat before a young Tom Riddle, smiling sweetly. "Such a charming young man," she cooed, reaching for a small, ornate cup. "This, my dear, belonged to Helga Hufflepuff herself." Tom smiled, his eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "And what about the locket?" he asked, voice smooth as silk. "Oh, yes." Hepzibah rummaged through her belongings, finally pulling out a heavy golden locket, Slytherin's mark carved into its surface. Gandalf tensed. Dumbledore's voice was quiet. That locket once belonged to his mother's family. Now it was in the hands of a stranger. Tom's fingers curled around the cup and locket. Later that evening, Hepzibah's house elf would find her lifeless on the floor, and Tom Riddle would be gone, taking the relics with him. The world swirled one last time. Gandalf staggered slightly, stepping back from the pensieve. For a moment, he simply stood silent, his grip tight around his staff. Finally, he exhaled. His path was decided long before he called himself Voldemort. Dumbledore nodded, but not set in stone. Gandalf turned to him. "Do you believe he could have been saved?" Dumbledore hesitated, then sighed. "Perhaps. Once, but he refused every chance he was given." Gandalf looked toward the closed doors of the chamber where Voldemort's body lay. He searched for power when all he needed was love. Dumbledore smiled sadly. "That, I believe, is the great tragedy of Tom Riddle." Gandalf placed a hand over his heart, closing his eyes briefly. "Then let us hope," he said softly, "that no soul follows the same path again." Outside, the morning sun was rising over Hogwarts. As Gandalf stepped onto the castle grounds, a familiar booming voice called out, "Oi, ye weren't thinking o' leaving without seeing the forest, were ye?" Hagrid stood at the edge of the forbidden forest, a wide grin on his bearded face. Beside him, Fang wagged his tail excitedly. Gandalf chuckled. "I would be honored to take a walk through your domain, my friend." Together they entered the forest. The air changed immediately, dense, cool, alive. The trees stood tall, their twisted roots deep in ancient earth. The magic of the place was raw, untamed. "This place is old," Gandalf murmured, running his fingers along the bark of a gnarled oak. "There is power here," Hagrid nodded. "Oh, aye. The forest's been here longer than Hogwarts itself. Plenty of creatures call it home." A rustling in the distance made Fang whimper. From the shadows, a herd of centaurs emerged, their golden eyes gleaming. A tall centaur with a silver mane stepped forward. Hagrid. Firenze, Hagrid greeted. Thought ye might show yourself. Firenze turned to Gandalf, studying him closely. You are not of this world, wizard. Gandalf smiled. And yet, I feel we have met before. Firenze tilted his head, then looked to the sky. The stars speak of many paths. Yours is long, and your journey never truly ends. Gandalf's smile widened. A wise observation. They continued walking. Near a clearing, a colony of thestrals grazed. Their skeletal forms and leathery wings made them seem spectral, yet they moved with an eerie grace. Gandalf approached one, his fingers brushing against its bony muzzle. The thestral huffed, its wings twitching. A most misunderstood creature, Gandalf observed. They do not bring death, but understanding. Hagrid nodded. Ye can only see 'em if ye've seen death. Gandalf's eyes darkened slightly. Then I see them very well. The forest stirred once more. The ground rumbled. Through the trees, an enormous figure emerged, a giant spider, its many eyes glinting in the half-light. Hagrid held up a hand. Don't worry, this one's not Aragog. He passed on, poor fella. Gandalf raised a brow. Giant spiders, that I am familiar with. The spider clicked its fangs but did not approach. Instead, it skittered back into the darkness, vanishing among the trees. Gandalf turned to Hagrid. Your forest is wondrous indeed. Hagrid beamed. Aye, it's a bit wild, but it's home. Gandalf took a deep breath, savoring the earthy scent of the forest. Thank you for this walk, my friend. It has been an honor. As dawn approached, Gandalf stood at the gates of Hogwarts, his staff in hand. He turned to Dumbledore and Snape. You have both lived beyond your intended time. Use it well. With a final nod, he tapped his staff, and in a swirl of golden light, he was gone. Dumbledore watched the sky. What an extraordinary wizard. Snape exhaled. For once, we agree. And so Hogwarts returned to normal, but all who had met Gandalf carried a piece of his wisdom with them.